The note arrived without warning. No knock, no footsteps on the porch. Just a folded piece of paper slipped under Elena Whitlock's front door like it was trash being kicked aside. Because to Harrison Beckett, that's exactly what it was. She almost didn't open it. Almost. Miss Whitlock, I find I am unable to escort you to the harvest dance this evening. Prior obligations have arisen. I trust you will understand. H. Beckett. 8 words to cancel. 4 more to dismiss her feelings entirely. Not a single one of apology. Elena stood in the middle of her kitchen, still in her work dress, her good shoes already set by the door, and read those 2 sentences 4 times. Then she set the note down on the table with the careful, deliberate slowness of a woman trying very hard not to throw something. Outside, Dry Creek was already celebrating. Before we go any further, if you've ever been dismissed like you didn't matter, like your feelings were an inconvenience someone needed to get rid of quickly, then this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next will surprise you in ways you didn't see coming. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Dry Creek, Texas, 1884. Elena Whitlock had not planned on being a woman who needed much. That hadn't always been true. There was a time, not so long ago really, when she had allowed herself small, careful hopes. A stable life. A good man, maybe. The kind of future her father had worked himself hollow trying to give her before the fever took him 18 months back and left her with a piece of land, a half-empty house, and a town full of people who watched her with a mixture of pity and quiet curiosity, wondering how long she'd last on her own. She'd lasted, longer than most expected. That was one thing about Elena. She was not particularly good at quitting, but tonight she had let herself want something simple. One evening, music and lantern light, and maybe the small grace of not eating dinner alone. Harrison Beckett had asked her to the harvest dance 3 weeks prior, in front of the dry goods counter at Pruitt's store, with enough people around that it had felt official. Real. He was charming in the way wealthy men sometimes were. Easy with his smiles, generous with his words, careful never to say anything you could hold him to later. She should have noticed that last part sooner. Elena picked up the note again, not because she expected the words to change, but because sometimes you had to look at something painful directly before you could decide what to do with it. She read it once more, set it down, walked to the small mirror hung beside the kitchen window, and looked at herself for a long moment. She was not a vain woman. She knew what she looked like. Dark hair she kept pulled back because loose hair got in the way of work. Brown eyes that people called serious more often than pretty. Hands roughened from 2 years of doing everything herself. She wasn't beautiful in the way town women sometimes were beautiful, soft and carefully kept. She was something else. Durable, maybe. Her father had called her iron-spined, and he'd meant it as a compliment. She didn't feel particularly iron-spined right now. She felt embarrassed. That was the honest word for it. Not heartbroken. She hadn't known Harrison Beckett long enough for heartbreak, but embarrassed in the deep, burning way that came from realizing you had let yourself hope for something and someone had noticed and decided to step on it anyway. The worst part wasn't the note. The worst part was that people had seen her say yes to him at Pruitt's store. Mrs. Garfield had been there, Tom Pruitt himself, and the Harker girl who was 17 and had the fastest mouth in 3 counties. By sundown, everyone in Dry Creek would know that Harrison Beckett had taken back his invitation to the harvest dance and left Elena Whitlock home alone, and they would all have their own ideas about why. She pressed her fingers flat against the kitchen table and breathed. She was not going to cry about Harrison Beckett. That was a firm decision. What she was going to do, she wasn't entirely sure yet. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of fiddle music starting up. The dance was 3 blocks away at the town hall, and sound carried easily in Dry Creek on a quiet October evening. Someone was tuning up, running through scales, getting ready. In an hour, the place would be full. Families and ranch hands and shopkeepers and their wives, everyone in their best clothes, everyone pretending for one night that the frontier was not as hard and unforgiving as it actually was. She had pressed her green dress herself that morning. It was hanging on the back of the bedroom door right now. She hadn't even put it on yet. Elena looked at the note one more time. Then she picked it up, crossed to the small iron stove in the corner, opened the grate, and dropped it in. She watched the paper catch and curl and turn to ash, and she felt not better, exactly, but cleaner. Like she'd made a decision without quite deciding anything yet. That was when the knock came. 3 knocks. Even, unhurried, the kind of knock that didn't expect to be ignored but wasn't going to pound the door down either. Not a social knock. Not a neighbor dropping by. Something steadier than that. Elena stood still for a moment. She wasn't expecting anyone. The fiddle music drifted in through the kitchen window, thin and sweet in the cool evening air. She crossed the room and opened the door. Sheriff Nathan Cross was standing on her porch. He was not, at first glance, the kind of man you'd write poems about. He was tall, but not dramatically so, built with the quiet solidity of someone who spent more time working than talking about it. His face was weathered, late 30s, maybe 40, though the sun and years made it hard to pin down precisely. And there was a scar that ran from just below his left eye to the corner of his jaw that he never explained, and no one in town was particularly brave enough to ask about. He wore his badge the way other men wore their skin, like he'd forgotten it was there. He was holding his hat in both hands. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Sheriff?" She waited. Nathan Cross was not a man who spoke before he'd thought something through, and Elena had enough sense not to rush him. He looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes that never seemed to be assessing you so much as simply seeing you clearly, which was somehow more unnerving. "I heard about Beckett," he said finally. The embarrassment came back, sharp and hot. "News travels fast. It's a small town." "It is." She held the door edge. "Was there something you needed, Sheriff? If this is about the property tax paperwork, I told Mr. Holt it would be ready by—" "It's not about paperwork." He turned the hat over in his hands once, a small, unconscious gesture she would remember later. "I was planning to go to the dance tonight, hadn't much wanted to go alone." He paused. "If you were willing, I thought I'd ask if you'd come with me." Elena looked at him. He looked back at her. He didn't add anything. He didn't soften it or apologize for the circumstances or try to make it sound like more than it was. He just asked, and then he waited, and that straightforwardness was so unusual that it took her a second to figure out what to do with it. "You feel sorry for me," she said. Not an accusation exactly, just needing to be clear. "No," he said, simply, like the idea hadn't occurred to him. "I've been meaning to ask you to something for about 4 months. I just took longer than I should have getting around to it." She stared at him. 4 months. He said it the same way he would have said it was 20 degrees outside, as a plain fact, presented without decoration. "Harrison Beckett asked me first," she pointed out. "I know." Something in his expression shifted, just slightly. "He talks faster than I do." Against every reasonable intention, Elena almost smiled. She didn't quite let herself, but it was a near thing. She thought about the green dress on her bedroom door. She thought about the note turning to ash in the stove. She thought about the fiddle music still floating up the street, getting steadier now, finding its rhythm. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. She thought she saw something move in his face. Not quite a smile either, but something in that neighborhood. "I'll wait," he said. She closed the door and stood in her kitchen for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went to put on the green dress. She was ready in 8 minutes, not 10, which was a point of quiet satisfaction she allowed herself. She pinned her hair up properly, put on her mother's small pearl earrings, the only pair she owned, and took one look in the mirror. Not bad. Not the version of herself she might have imagined for the evening, which had involved being nervous and pleased about Harrison Beckett's hand at her elbow. This was different. She wasn't nervous about Nathan Cross. She was curious, which was something else entirely. He was where she'd left him, on the porch, turned sideways and looking out at the street. He hadn't moved much. She had the impression he was a man who could stand still for a long time without getting restless. He turned when he heard the door, looked at her. "Green suits you," he said. "Thank you." She came down the porch steps. He fell into step beside her, not offering his arm immediately, which she found she preferred. It felt less like a performance. They walked toward the town hall and the music. The first person who saw them was Mrs. Garfield, standing outside the hall with a cup of punch, an expression that shifted through 3 or 4 things in about 2 seconds. Elena held her head level and kept walking. She was aware that Nathan, beside her, noticed Mrs. Garfield too, and that he didn't alter his pace or his expression in the slightest. "People are going to talk," Elena said quietly, not slowing down. "They were going to talk either way," he said. She thought about that. He was right. If she'd stayed home, they'd have talked. If she'd come alone, they'd have talked. Now they'd talk about this instead, and honestly, she found she minded it considerably less. They went inside. The Dry Creek Town Hall smelled like pine resin and tobacco, and the particular combination of wood smoke and beeswax candles that meant celebration in 1884. The fiddle player had been joined by a man with a squeeze-box accordion, and together they were working through something fast and lively that had already gotten half the room onto the floor. People noticed them. Of course they noticed. This was Dry Creek, and Harrison Beckett's note had had approximately 4 hours to circulate through the gossip channels, which in a small Texas town meant every soul in the building knew the general outline of the situation before Elena and Nathan even came through the door. She could feel it, the way you feel a room's attention shift without anyone saying anything, that particular quality of suddenly being watched. Nathan guided her toward the refreshment table without comment and handed her a cup of punch. She accepted it. He stood beside her and surveyed the room with the same unhurried calm he seemed to bring to every situation. And gradually, because standing next to a man who is visibly unbothered by being stared at is a surprisingly effective antidote to minding being stared at yourself, Elena felt her shoulders come down from somewhere around her ears. "You do this often?" she asked. "Stand at dances?" He considered. "Not particularly." "You're not much of a dancer?" He looked at her. "I didn't say that." She couldn't quite read that look, but it did something interesting to her pulse that she decided to think about later. "Then what did you say?" "I said I don't stand at dances often." He set his own cup down on the edge of the table. "You want to dance, Miss Whitlock?" She thought about Harrison Beckett's note. She thought about this man showing up on her porch with his hat in his hands and no apology for the circumstances. She thought about the 4 months he'd apparently spent meaning to ask her something. "Elena," she said. He paused. "What?" "If you're going to ask me to dance, you should probably use my name." Something happened around his eyes. Not quite a smile, she'd decided, was how Nathan Cross showed most things. "You want to dance, Elena?" She held out her hand. "Yes," she said. "I do. The thing about Nathan Cross that the town of Dry Creek knew, he was a good sheriff. Thorough, fair-minded, not prone to shortcuts or personal favors, hard to rattle. He'd been in Dry Creek for 6 years, long enough to know every family and their particular troubles, long enough to have earned his reputation one quiet decision at a time. He wasn't flashy about it. That was the other thing about him. The man was constitutionally incapable of anything that looked like showing off. The thing about Nathan Cross that very few people knew. He had been watching Elena Whitlock for 4 months, not following her, not with any particular plan, just noticing. He noticed when she came into Pruitt's store and bargained quietly but efficiently over seed prices. He noticed when she drove her own wagon to the cattle auction in September and sat in the back row and watched everything with those serious brown eyes, learning the market, and left without buying anything because the prices weren't right, and she knew it. He noticed when old Pete Garza's fence came down in the August storms, and Elena spent 2 days helping him repair it without telling anyone or expecting thanks. He'd noticed a lot of things, and he'd told himself he'd ask her to something eventually, when the right moment presented itself. And then Harrison Beckett had gotten there first, and Nathan had spent 3 weeks feeling a particular kind of irritation with himself for waiting. So when word reached him at 4:30 in the afternoon that Beckett had sent a note pulling out of their arrangement, his first feeling wasn't pity for Elena. His first feeling, if he was being honest with himself, was something considerably less charitable toward Harrison Beckett, followed by the recognition that he had run out of reasons to wait any longer. He danced with her twice. The second time was a slower piece, and she was a composed dancer, self-possessed, following without being passive about it. She'd learned somewhere that knew what it was doing. "Your mother teach you?" he asked. He wasn't much for small talk, but dancing in silence felt deliberate. She tried, Elena said. My father actually managed it. He said a woman who could dance well was a woman who could think on her feet. She paused. He wasn't wrong. What was he like? She looked up at him. People didn't usually ask about her father directly. They offered condolences and moved on, which was easier for everyone. Stubborn, she said. Funny when he wanted to be. He could spend 2 hours arguing over the price of something and then turn around and give it away for free if he thought someone needed it. She was quiet for a moment. He built the ranch himself, every board. I know, Nathan said. I watched him do some of it. She looked at him again, differently this time. You knew my father? Not well. We spoke a few times. He was a good man. He meant it plainly, without flourish. He'd have been proud of what you've done with the place. Elena said nothing for a moment. The accordion and fiddle carried them through another measure. When she spoke, her voice was carefully level. You don't have to say that. I know I don't. She looked at his face, searching for the performance in it, the polite lie dressed up as comfort. She didn't find one. That was the unsettling thing about Nathan Cross. She was beginning to understand. He said what he meant, which meant you had to take it at face value, which was not something she was particularly practiced at doing. Thank you, she said finally, and meant it. It was somewhere in the second hour of the evening, while Elena was talking with Martha Holt near the back wall, and Nathan had gone to get more punch, that she first heard the name Victor Granger. She wasn't meant to hear it. The two men talking were standing just outside the side door to the hall, their voices carrying in that way voices did in October when the air was cool and still, when you spoke at what you thought was a private volume and didn't realize how far it traveled. Beckett didn't manage it, one of the voices said. Low, clipped, displeased. He said the woman wouldn't, the second voice quieter. Granger didn't pay him to say what she would or wouldn't. He paid him to get it done. A pause. That land is the last piece. The railroad can't move without it. Granger isn't patient. Elena stopped talking to Martha mid-sentence. Martha looked at her. Elena, are you all right? Fine, she said very quietly. Would you excuse me for just one moment? She didn't move toward the door. She stayed exactly where she was and made herself look normal while her mind did something fast and cold and extremely unpleasant. Get it done. Beckett. Her land. The railroad. She thought about Harrison Beckett, who had appeared in Dry Creek 8 weeks ago with his easy smile and his compliments and his particular interest in her ranch's western boundary. She thought about how he'd asked her, in that charming, casual way of his, what her plans were for the property, whether she'd considered selling, whether she'd thought about how much easier her life could be if she weren't trying to run the place alone. She had thought those were the beginnings of caring about her. They were not. Nathan reappeared at her elbow with the punch and looked at her face and stopped. What happened? She looked at him. Her voice, when it came, was very steady. Someone paid Harrison Beckett to court me, she said. So I'd sell my land. Nathan went very still. The fiddle played on. Around them the town danced and laughed and ate and had no idea that Elena Whitlock had just learned the exact shape and cost of her humiliation. Nathan set down both cups of punch on the nearest flat surface. He looked at her with those gray eyes, and she could see something happening behind them. Something quiet, but absolute. Tell me what you heard, he said. So she told him, every word exactly as she'd heard it, with the particular clarity of someone whose mind had gone very cold and very focused. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Victor Granger, he said. Not a question. You know the name? I know it. He said it with something in his voice she hadn't heard there before, sorry. Something that was not quite anger, but in the same county. I've been hearing it in connection with land sales up toward Abilene. Complaints. Nothing I could touch yet. Yet, she said. He looked at her. Yet, he agreed. Outside, the October night had gone fully dark. The fiddle player was taking a break, and in the quiet gap between songs, Elena could hear her own heartbeat, which was steady. She was surprised to find it was steady. She had every reason to be shaking right now, and she was not. Nathan was watching her carefully. "You all right?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'm not frightened, if that's what you're asking." He nodded, slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. "I wasn't going to ask that," he said. "I was going to ask what you want to do." What she wanted to do was find Harrison Beckett and tell him exactly what she thought of him, but that was a feeling, not a plan. She breathed. She thought about her father, who'd built that ranch board by board. She thought about what it meant that someone powerful enough to hire a man to court her had decided her land was worth having. "I want to keep my land," she said, "and I want whoever is behind this to not be able to do this to someone else." Nathan Cross looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight of the Dry Creek Town Hall, with the music not yet restarted and the crowd around them cheerful and oblivious, and something settled in his expression that she would not understand the full weight of until much later. "All right," he said. "Then we should talk." And somewhere under the steady resolve, under the anger, under the cold clarity of understanding she'd been manipulated, somewhere beneath all of it, Elena Whitlock was aware of a stranger fact. She was glad Nathan Cross had knocked on her door tonight. Not because she needed rescuing, she didn't, because there are some fights that are better not to start alone. They talked until the dance ended. Not on the floor, not in the middle of the room where everyone could watch their expressions. Nathan had steered them quietly to a corner near the coat racks, the least glamorous spot in the building, where the light was dim and nobody had much reason to linger. Elena appreciated that. She had no interest in performing composure for an audience right now. She was too busy actually having it. She told him everything she could remember about Harrison Beckett. Not just the overheard conversation, but the weeks before it. The visits, the questions, the particular way he'd always managed to steer conversation toward the ranch's western pasture, toward the creek boundary, toward what the land was worth, and whether she'd ever considered her options. She'd thought he was making conversation. She'd thought, embarrassingly, that he was interested in her life. "He asked me twice about the survey markers," she said. "I thought it was odd, but I let it go." Nathan was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, listening with the focused stillness of a man cataloging details. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That the western boundary runs to the old Callaway Creek bend and that my father had it surveyed properly in 1871. She paused. "He seemed pleased about that." "I thought he was pleased because he was interested. He was pleased because that's exactly what someone buying land wants to hear. Clean title, clear lines." Nathan made a low sound in his throat that was not quite a word. "Granger's been working this county for a while. Small pieces. Patient." His jaw moved. "I should have connected it sooner. You couldn't have known. I knew Granger's name was coming up in Abilene. I knew there were land complaints. I should have pulled that thread harder." He said it flatly, without self-pity, just accounting for a mistake the way a man did when he intended not to make it again. Elena looked at him. This was another thing she was learning about Nathan Cross in one evening. He didn't make excuses for himself, but he also didn't perform guilt. He just noted the error and moved on toward fixing it. She found that she respected that considerably. "What do you know about the railroad?" she asked. "The Western Continental Line has been trying to come through this county for 2 years. There's a route that works, but it cuts right through the southern edge of the Whitlock property." He looked at her. "Your creek boundary is what makes it viable. Without that access point, they'd have to reroute through the Sanchez Ridge, which costs them about $100,000 more in grading." Elena absorbed this. $100,000. The number sat in her chest like a stone. "And my land would cost considerably less than that. To buy legitimately, yes. To steal through a forged debt or a manipulated sale." He let the sentence finish itself. The fiddle player packed up his instrument across the room. People were starting to gather coats and say their goodnights. The evening was winding down around them, soft and ordinary, completely indifferent to the fact that Elena had just discovered the entire shape of a scheme that had been running around her life for weeks. "Beckett was going to what? Convince me to sell?" she asked. "That was his assignment?" "Most likely. Start with courtship, build trust, find the right moment to make an offer seem natural." Nathan's voice was even, almost clinical, but there was something under it. If that didn't work, there are other methods. Forged debt claims, pressure on suppliers, making a place difficult to run until the owner gets desperate enough to take any price. He paused. Granger's done it before. I just couldn't prove it. Elena said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about how close she'd come to believing Harrison Beckett. Not to loving him, she'd never been quite that far gone, but to trusting him, to letting him into her confidence. She told him about the dry summer and the fence repair costs and the fact that she was running the ranch with 2 hired hands because she couldn't afford a third. She'd told him those things because he'd seemed interested, and she was lonely sometimes in ways she didn't usually let herself admit. That was the part that made her angry. Not that someone wanted her land. Land was just land in the end, a thing with a price. What made her angry was that they'd used her loneliness to get at it, had looked at a woman on her own and decided that was the door. Elena. Nathan was watching her face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, she said carefully, that I'm not selling. He nodded. That's what I figured. And I'm thinking that if Victor Granger has done this to other families, there are other people in this county who've lost land they shouldn't have lost. She looked at him directly. Am I right? He was quiet for a beat. Probably, he said. Yes. Then this isn't just my problem. He didn't argue with that. No, he said. It isn't. Outside, the first cold of autumn had sharpened into something that bit. Elena pulled her shawl tighter as Nathan walked her home, the two of them moving through Dry Creek's quiet streets at an easy pace, not rushing, the conversation between them different now, lower, more careful, the kind you had when you were working something out rather than simply talking. He left her at her porch with a straightforward goodnight and no dramatics, which she appreciated, and she stood in her kitchen afterward for a long time without lighting the lamp. Just thinking. The house felt different than it had 4 hours ago, when she'd stood reading a cold note and listening to fiddle music and feeling small. It didn't feel small now. It felt like a place worth fighting for. She went to bed determined. She did not sleep particularly well. Morning in October came gray and cold and honest about it. Elena was up before light, as she usually was, and by the time the sun was actually visible, she'd already fed the chickens. Spoken briefly with her hired hand Caleb about the fence line on the north quarter that still needed attention, and drunk 2 cups of coffee standing at the kitchen window watching the road. She was watching the road, she admitted to herself, in case anyone came down it that she needed to be ready for. She didn't know exactly what Granger's next move would be. She knew enough to understand there would be one. Nathan Cross arrived at 9. He knocked, which she noted. Some men in his position would have treated her place as a professional location and come through without ceremony. He knocked and waited. She opened the door. He was in his working clothes, badge present, hat on. He looked like he hadn't slept especially well either, which made her feel marginally better about her own night. I found something this morning, he said, by way of greeting. She stepped back and let him in. He had a folded document that he set on the kitchen table without sitting down. She came to stand beside him and look at it. A surveyor's map, she realized. But not of her land. Of the county. The whole southeastern section, with properties marked and annotated in small, precise pencil numbers. I pulled the land registry records, he said. Went back 3 years. He pointed to a cluster of marks in the southern section. 4 properties changed hands in an 18-month window, all in the corridor that the Western Continental route would need. 3 of them went below assessed value. 2 of the original owners left the county entirely. He pointed to another mark. This one, the Reyes family, filed a debt complaint that they said was fraudulent. The complaint was dismissed. Elena studied the map. The corridor was clear once you were looking for it. A deliberate path, property by property, clearing a route. And at the end of it, marked with nothing but its own survey lines, was the Whitlock Ranch. They planned this for years, she said. At least 2, probably 3. His finger traced the path. Granger doesn't move fast. He moves clean. By the time anyone notices the pattern, the properties are sold, the sellers are gone, and there's nothing left to prove. He looked up at her. Your land is the last piece. Without it, the route doesn't work. So I'm not just an inconvenience, she said. I'm the problem. You're the last problem, he said. Which means you're the most important one. She straightened up and looked at the map for another moment. A railroad route drawn across 3 years of other people's losses, families displaced, a property chain built on pressure and fraud, and the quiet desperation of people trying to survive on their own. Her father's voice was somewhere in the back of her head. Not words, just a feeling. The particular stubbornness of a man who'd nailed every board of this house himself and would not have understood how to give it up. "What do we do?" she asked. "First, I need to know exactly what Granger has on you. Any debts, notes due, anything he could use?" "No," she said it with certainty. "I've been careful. I owe Pruitt's store $12 on a running account, and that's the end of it." "Any lease arrangements? Grazing rights sold to anyone?" "Nothing." "Good." He folded the map. "The first thing Granger will try is the legitimate route, another offer on the land, higher this time, through a broker so his name doesn't appear directly. He'll want it to look clean. And if I say no..." Nathan's expression didn't change much. "Then it gets less clean." She crossed her arms. "How much less?" He looked at her steadily. "I don't want to frighten you. I'd rather be frightened with accurate information than comfortable with none," she said. "Sheriff..." He seemed to consider that for a moment, then, "Pressure on your suppliers. Sudden problems with your water rights. Maybe a debt claim filed against the property. Forged, likely, but it takes time and money to fight, and Granger knows most people don't have either. Physical intimidation is possible, but Granger usually uses it as a last resort because it creates witnesses." Elena was quiet. Each item he listed landed with a specific weight. She ran through them one by one and thought about what she had and didn't have to fight each of them. "I need to talk to the Reyes family," she said. Nathan blinked. "What?" "The family that filed the debt complaint. You said they're still in the county?" "Marcos Reyes is. His wife's family is in San Antonio. They split their time." "Elena, if they filed a complaint, they have documentation. Something." She was thinking out loud now, moving around the kitchen as she did when a problem had her properly engaged. "And if Granger has done this to 4 families, there may be others who didn't file anything because they didn't think anyone would listen. I want to talk to them." Nathan watched her pace. "That's not..." He stopped. She looked at him. "Not what?" "I was going to say it's not safe," he said. "But I think you'd tell me what you did last night about being frightened versus informed, and I'd have to give you that." He rubbed his jaw. "It's not without risk. If Granger has people watching, and he likely does, he'll know you're gathering information." "Good," Elena said. "Let him know." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "You want him to know you're fighting back." "I want him to know immediately so he stops wasting time with subtle approaches and shows himself more clearly." She stopped pacing. "The more he moves, the more you can see. You said his mistakes are what you need. Well, he won't make mistakes while he thinks I'm isolated and uninformed." The kitchen was quiet except for the October wind finding the gap under the back door. Caleb's voice, distant, came from somewhere near the barn. Nathan Cross stood in her kitchen with his map in his hand and looked at the woman in front of him with an expression she would have had trouble naming. Not admiration exactly, or maybe it was, but a kind which had nothing performative in it, the kind that was quieter and more particular than that. "All right," he said. "I'll arrange for us to speak with Marcos Reyes." "Today," Elena said. "Today," he agreed. And if it surprised him, he didn't show it, and it. Marcos Reyes was a compact, careful man of about 50 who wore his wariness openly, the way a man did when he'd been burned and didn't see much point in pretending otherwise. He met them on the road outside his brother-in-law's place, not inviting them in, which Nathan had expected. Trust was a thing Granger's methods had specifically eroded, and you couldn't just ask for it back in an afternoon. "I know who you are," Marcos said to Nathan, without particular hostility. "And I know the sheriff of Dry Creek wasn't the one who helped us when we needed it." He glanced at Elena. "Don't know you?" "Elena Whitlock," she said. She didn't offer her hand, reading him correctly. Not the moment for gestures. "My ranch is the last piece Granger needs for his railroad corridor. He had a man courting me to get at it." Marcos looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, not yet, but a recognition. How long? 8 weeks. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He looked at Nathan. And now you're interested. I was interested before, Nathan said. I didn't have enough to work with. We gave you a complaint. That was filed with the county court, not with my office, and it was dismissed before I knew it existed. Nathan held the man's gaze. I should have known. I'm telling you that, but I didn't, and I can't change it. What I can change is what happens from here. Marcos chewed on that for a moment. He looked at Elena again. What do you want from me? Whatever you kept, she said. Letters, records, anything with Granger's name, or the name of anyone who worked for him, anything you documented before they pushed you out. They didn't push me out, Marcos said, with a sharpness that told her that was a particular wound. I sold. I'm not proud of it. But my wife was scared, and they were making it hard to breathe. And I had 2 children in that house, and... He stopped. I sold. I know, Elena said quietly. I'm not here to judge that. I'm here because I don't want to do the same thing, and I think you might be able to help me not to. The wind came through. A dog barked somewhere on the property. Marcos Reyes stood in the road and looked at the woman who was standing exactly where he'd stood 2 years ago, and she could see him making a decision. Come inside, he said. My wife made coffee. But they were inside for 2 hours. What Marcos had kept, despite leaving, despite everything, was a battered tin box tucked at the bottom of a trunk that had come with them from the old property. Inside was a collection of papers that told a story Nathan could not stop himself from reading with a particular focused intensity. A letter from a broker offering to buy the Reyes land at a price 30% below its value. The letter polite and reasonable in tone. A second letter less polite. A third that mentioned an outstanding debt claim that Marcos insisted had been fabricated, a copy of the debt filing itself. And at the bottom, a single letter signed not by a broker, but by a man named Dale Cutter, who described himself as representing Western Continental land acquisition interests. Nathan held that letter for a long time. Cutter, he said. You know who Cutter is? He asked Elena. She shook her head. He's Granger's operations man. Does the work Granger doesn't want his name on. He looked at Marcos. This letter puts Cutter in contact with you directly. That's a connection. It wasn't enough for the court, Marcos said bitterly. It wasn't enough alone, Nathan said. It might be enough as part of something larger. He looked up. Can I take this? Marcos hesitated. His wife, Rosa, a small woman with steady eyes who'd been quiet through most of it, put her hand on her husband's arm. Give it to him, she said. Not a question. Marcos looked at Nathan. If you let it disappear like the complaint. It won't, Nathan said. You have my word. Marcos looked at Elena, of all people, as though Nathan's word was something she might be better positioned to evaluate. She met his gaze and nodded, just once, and something about that seemed to settle it. He let Nathan take the letter. Walking back to the horses, Nathan tucked the letter carefully inside his jacket. Elena walked beside him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The afternoon light was thin and pale, the kind of October light that made everything look temporary. He looked at me when he decided, Elena said. Not you. I noticed. Why? Nathan was quiet for a beat. Because you're the one with something to lose, he said. He's already lost his. He wanted to know if you understood what you were getting into. Elena thought about that. Do I? Probably not entirely, he said honestly, but that didn't seem to bother him. It doesn't bother you? He looked at her sideways as they walked. You told me last night you'd rather be frightened with accurate information. I believed you. She almost smiled. She was starting to recognize that she almost smiled around Nathan Cross fairly often, which was something she hadn't expected from this evening that had started with a cold note and was still ending apparently, into the next day, with a different kind of beginning entirely. Well, Harrison Beckett left Dry Creek on a Tuesday. He didn't announce it. He didn't come by to explain or apologize or even collect the small debt he was theoretically owed at the hotel where he'd been running a tab. He simply wasn't there one morning, his room cleared out, his horse gone from the livery stable, no forwarding word left with anyone. Elena found out from Tom Pruitt, who mentioned it with the careful neutrality of a man who had his own theories and wasn't going to voice them unless pressed. She felt something when she heard it. Not the relief she'd expected. Not satisfaction. Something duller and colder. The particular feeling of watching someone take away even the possibility of confrontation, of confirmation, of him having to look at her and admit what he'd been doing. He'd robbed her of that, which was, she supposed, entirely consistent with the kind of man he was. She mentioned it to Nathan when he came by that afternoon. "I know," he said. He was at her kitchen table with the Reyes letter and 3 other documents he'd pulled from county records, making notes in a small book he kept in his shirt pocket. He'd been doing that, coming by in the afternoons, working, telling her what he found, asking what she remembered. It had become, without either of them quite deciding it, a regular thing. "I had someone watching the hotel. Didn't have grounds to stop him leaving." "Do you think Granger sent him away? Or he left on his own when he realized the assignment had gone sideways?" Nathan's pen moved across the page. "Doesn't matter much. Beckett was a hired tool. Granger's the structure." She poured coffee and set a cup by his elbow without asking if he wanted it, which had also become a regular thing. He took it without looking up, which was somehow not rude, just easy, the way things became easy when people stopped performing for each other. "Victor Granger," she said, sitting across from him. "Tell me about him." Nathan put down the pen. He didn't reach for the coffee immediately. He seemed to be choosing what to say and how much of it to say. "Came up from the Gulf Coast about 8 years ago. Made money early in cattle brokering. Moved into land when he figured out where the railroads were heading. He's smart. Careful with his direct exposure. He keeps men like Cutter between himself and the dirty work. Has lawyers in Austin who are very good and very expensive. Has he ever been charged with anything? Questioned twice in land disputes in Bayard County. Nothing stuck." He picked up the coffee. "He's not reckless. That's what makes him difficult." "But Beckett ran," Elena said. "That's a reaction. Something about this situation made someone nervous enough to move." Nathan looked at her. She could see him turning that over. "You," he said. "Me? You didn't react the way they planned. Beckett was supposed to have you soft and trusting by now. Instead, you're gathering documentation and talking to displaced families." A beat. Granger expected a grieving woman alone on a ranch. He got something else. Elena held her coffee cup and thought about what it meant to be underestimated by dangerous men. It was not, she decided, entirely without its uses. She thought about Marcos Reyes' face when he decided to give them the letter. She thought about Rosa's hand on her husband's arm. She thought about the 3 other properties on Nathan's map, each one a family that had been maneuvered out of something they'd built. "There are people in this county," she said slowly, "who sold land they didn't want to sell, who are still here or nearby. And who know what happened to them?" She looked at Nathan. "What if they knew they weren't alone in it? What if they knew someone was paying attention?" Nathan studied her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking a single woman with a land dispute is something Granger can manage. I'm thinking a dozen families with documented grievances, coordinated, visible." She stopped. "Is that possible?" "It's not impossible," he said carefully. "It would require trust. People who've been through what they've been through don't offer that easily." "No," she agreed. "But I do." She met his eyes. "I can ask them. Not as an official inquiry. I know I'm not that. Just as a neighbor. As someone in the same position who wants to understand what happened to them." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Caleb was hammering something near the barn, a steady rhythm that carried in the still afternoon air. "If you start that," Nathan said, "Granger will know. And he will move harder." "I know." "Elena." He said her name with a particular weight to it, the same weight it had had when he'd asked her at the dance and she'd told him to use it. "I need you to understand that harder means real danger, not just canceled dates and cold notes. He has men who do more than deliver letters." She sat with that. She let herself be genuinely scared for a moment, not performing calm, not pushing it aside, but actually feeling the size of it. A man with money and lawyers and hired force and 3 years of careful planning. And her, with a ranch and a tin box of someone else's documents, and a sheriff with a small notebook full of careful notes. She was scared. That was true. She was also, in some deep place that she recognized as coming directly from her father, absolutely unwilling to let that be the deciding thing. "I understand," she said. "I'm still asking." Nathan looked at her for a long, serious moment. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a second small notebook, unused, she saw, and set it on the table in front of her. "Keep records of every conversation," he said. "Names, dates, what they tell you. Don't write it in a way that identifies them until they've agreed to go on record. Keep the notebook somewhere Granger's people won't find it if they come through here." She picked up the notebook. "Are you telling me to do this or helping me do it?" He picked up his pen again. "Both," he said, and went back to his notes. She looked at the notebook in her hand, then she opened it to the first page, found the pencil she kept in her apron pocket, and wrote the date at the top. Outside, Caleb's hammer kept its rhythm. The October light stretched long and thin across the kitchen floor. Somewhere between a cold note slipped under a door and a Tuesday afternoon in her own kitchen, Elena Whitlock had stopped being a woman things happened to and become something else. She was not entirely sure yet what to call it, but it felt, in the specific way that true things feel, like the right direction. And in the house that her father had built board by board, with a sheriff's careful note spread across her kitchen table and a blank notebook open in her hands, she began to write. The notebook filled faster than Elena expected. By the end of the first week, she had spoken to 4 families. By the end of the second, 7. They came to her carefully, the way people came to things they half believed in and half feared. A knock at an odd hour, a quiet word passed through a mutual neighbor, someone's cousin mentioning that Elena Whitlock was asking questions and keeping records, and not, apparently, planning to sell. Word moved through the ranch families of the county the way water moved through dry ground. Slow at first, then all at once. The Mendoza family had lost their south pasture to a debt claim they hadn't understood until it was too late, filed in a county court 2 towns over where they had no connections and no lawyer. The Halbert widow, a woman named June, who was 61 and had the posture of someone who'd been hit and decided not to fall down, told Elena that a man had come to her door 3 times in 1 month, each visit more pointed than the last, until she'd signed something she now believed she hadn't read carefully enough. The Okafor brothers, who'd run a small horse operation east of Dry Creek, had simply been frozen out of their water supply. A dispute manufactured with their upstream neighbor, a dispute that turned out to have been organized, stoked, by a man none of them could quite trace back, but whose description matched Dale Cutter closely enough that Nathan, when Elena told him, went very quiet in a way that meant he was angry. She wrote it all down. Names, dates, specifics. The notebook Nathan had given her was half full, and she'd started a second one she kept behind the loose brick in the kitchen hearth, the same place her father had kept his important papers. It was not a sophisticated hiding place. It was, however, the one place in the house that felt like it belonged to the foundation of the thing. The offer arrived on a Thursday morning, not from Beckett this time. Beckett was gone, and apparently staying gone. This one came in a sealed envelope, delivered by a man Elena didn't recognize. Well-dressed, not local, the kind of careful blankness on his face that suggested he was paid to deliver things without opinions about their contents. The letter inside was from a land brokerage office in Austin she'd never heard of, offering to purchase the Whitlock property at a price that was, she had to admit, significantly higher than any reasonable market value for the land. The letter was polite. It expressed admiration for her management of the property. It mentioned, almost in passing, that the offer was time-sensitive and would not remain open indefinitely. She read it twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. Nathan arrived at noon, which had become, without formal arrangement, approximately when he arrived most days now. She handed him the letter before he sat down. He read it, set it down. "Higher than I expected," he said. "High enough to be tempting if I didn't know what I know. High enough to seem generous instead of desperate." He turned the letter over, looked at the back, nothing, and turned it front again. "The brokerage is real, registered in Austin, but if you pull the ownership records, I'd expect to find a holding company that connects back to Western Continental interests." He folded it. "This is the clean attempt, the one where they can say later that they offered a fair price. And when I refuse, He looked at her steadily. Then we're into the next phase. She'd known that. She'd been knowing it for 2 weeks, building toward it the way you built toward a storm you could see coming across flat land, watching the sky, checking what you'd secured, deciding what you were willing to lose. How long do we have? Before they move harder? A week? Maybe 2. He put the letter inside his jacket. I've been in contact with a federal land office inspector in San Antonio, a man named Tolliver. He's been building a file on Western Continental's acquisition methods for about 8 months. What I've collected here, the Reyes documents, the Cutter letter, what you've gathered from the families, it's more than he has for any single county. If I send it to him, do it, Elena said. It means giving up some control of the timeline. Nathan. She said his name with the particular patience she used when she needed him to stop presenting her with considerations and hear her actual answer. Send it. He looked at her for a moment, then, all right. He paused. There's one more thing. She waited. I want to bring the families together, not just collect their stories separately. A meeting, here or somewhere central, where Tolliver's office can hear directly from them. He watched her face. It's asking a lot of people who are already scared. Elena thought about June Halbert's posture, about Marcos Reyes's face when he'd decided to hand over the letter, about the Mendoza family's youngest daughter, who'd sat in the corner during Elena's visit and listened to everything with wide, serious eyes that were too old for her age. Let me ask them, she said. You think they'll come? I think they're tired, she said, and tired people, when they finally see a way to stop being tired, will do more than you expect. She was not entirely sure she was only talking about them. She was coming back from the Halbert place on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the broker's letter, when she saw the men. There were 3 of them, sitting on horses at the edge of her property line, not moving, just watching the road, watching her come, with the particular stillness of men who had been told to be visible. That was the point of it, not to hide, but to be seen, to be a fact she had to drive toward and past and know were there behind her. She did not slow down. She kept her pace, kept her eyes on the road ahead, and felt her heart rate do something unpleasant while she refused to show it on her face. She recognized the type without recognizing the men specifically. Hired muscle, the kind that came with expense accounts and no paperwork trail, and whose job at this stage was presence rather than action. They wanted her to feel watched. They wanted her to think about what came after presence. She got home, stabled the horse, went inside, and immediately wrote down what she'd seen. Time, location, approximate descriptions. Then she sat down and breathed for a minute, which she felt she was owed. Nathan was there within the hour. She hadn't sent for him. He'd seen the men himself from the road on his afternoon rounds and made directly for her place. 3, he said. Cutter's men, most likely. I've seen 2 of them before. They were in the county last spring around the time the Okafor water dispute started. They wanted me to see them, Elena said. Yes. So Granger knows the clean approach isn't working. He knows more than that. Nathan sat down. He looked tired in a way she'd started noticing. Must see. Not physically, but the kind of tired that came from being careful for a long time and knowing it had to get more careful before it could get less. I think he knows about the families, about the notebook. Someone's been watching more than just your road. Elena went still. How? Small town. People talk even when they're trying not to. He wasn't accusing her. He was just being accurate. It doesn't change the plan. It does change the urgency. He looked at her directly. Tolliver can be here in 4 days if I send word today. Then send it today. I will. He didn't move immediately. Elena, those men outside today, they're going to come back, and the next time they may come to the door instead of the road. She held his gaze. I know. You could stay in town. A few days, just until... No. She said it without heat, but with a finality that closed the subject. If I leave this property, Granger has already won a version of what he wants. I'm not giving him that. She paused. I'll ask Caleb to stay nights. He's offered before. Nathan looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. She'd begun to recognize these pauses. the ones where he was deciding something that wasn't about the case. They made something tighten in her chest in a way she was trying to be sensible about and finding increasingly difficult. "All right," he said. "I'll have Bill Crane ride the perimeter in the mornings." Bill was his deputy, a competent young man who asked few unnecessary questions. "And I'll send word to Tolliver tonight." "Good." She stood. "Are you hungry?" "I have biscuits from this morning." He looked slightly surprised, which she found she liked. It happened occasionally when she cut through the procedural part of things to the human part without warning. "Yes," he said. "Actually, yes." She went to get the biscuits, and behind her she heard him open his notebook and go back to his notes. And the kitchen felt like it was doing the thing it used to do when her father was alive and working at that same table. Full in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people in it. She did not let herself think too hard about that. Not yet. Or the meeting happened on a Tuesday evening at the Whitlock barn. 11 families came. Some had traveled most of the day. They brought their wariness with them in their coffee cups, and in a few cases their older children, who sat in the back and tried to look like they weren't listening while listening to every word. Elena stood at the front of the barn with a lantern on a nail overhead and Nathan beside her, not in front of her, and she understood without discussing it that he'd positioned himself that way deliberately. This was her gathering, her credibility that had brought these people in, and he was here as support, not authority. She was grateful for that in a way she didn't say. She told them why she'd asked them, simply, without flourish. What she'd learned, what Nathan had found in the county records, what the corridor on the map looked like when you saw all their properties marked together. She watched faces change as they understood it, that slow, ugly recognition of seeing the shape of something that had felt random and personal turn out to be neither. June Halbert said, "I thought it was just me." Her voice was level. "I thought I'd done something wrong." "You didn't," Elena said. "None of you did." "Easy to say now," said one of the Mendoza brothers, the older one, Francisco, who'd barely spoken during Elena's first visit. "Doesn't give us back the south pasture." "No," Ina said. "It doesn't. I won't pretend this fixes what already happened." She let that sit. "But it might stop him from doing it to someone else. And it might get the record corrected on what was done to you officially with federal documentation." She looked at Francisco directly. "I know that's not the pasture. I know it's not enough. I'm telling you it's what's possible, and I thought you deserved to decide for yourselves whether it's worth having." Francisco Mendoza looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Nathan. "You trust him?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. Francisco looked back at her. Something moved across his face. Not quite surrender, more like a man making a bet he'd lost faith in bets being winnable, deciding to make it anyway. "All right," he said. One by one, around the barn, heads nodded, not enthusiastically, not with any confidence that the world was about to do right by them, but with the particular resolution of people who had been knocked down and were choosing, one more time, to get up. Elena stood in her father's barn with the lantern swinging slightly overhead and felt something she didn't have an easy word for. Not triumph. This wasn't over, wasn't close to over. Not relief. Something closer to purpose, which was different from hope, in that hope was passive, and this was not. Nathan, beside her, opened his notebook. They talked for 3 hours. Inspector Tolliver arrived on a Saturday, earlier than expected, which Nathan took as a good sign. A man who moved his schedule to get somewhere faster was a man who thought what was there was worth getting to. He was younger than Elena had imagined, 40 or so, neat in his appearance, with a methodical quality to the way he moved and spoke that suggested he had encountered many people who tried to mislead him and had developed effective personal defenses against it. He shook Elena's hand firmly and looked at her directly and said, "Sheriff Cross tells me you've been doing my job for me," which she chose to take as a compliment. They sat at her kitchen table, the same kitchen table where Nathan had first spread the county map, where Elena had opened the blank notebook, where she'd poured coffee without asking and he'd taken it without looking up. And she laid out everything. The notebooks, the family accounts, the timeline, The Cutter letter from Marcos Reyes's tin box. The broker's letter with the too high offer. The three men on the road. Tolliver read carefully and asked precise questions and wrote his own notes in a hand so small she could barely read it from across the table. He asked Nathan questions about the county records, and Nathan answered them with the same careful precision. And for about an hour, Elena watched two men who were very good at their jobs work through a problem together, and felt the thing she'd been carrying for 3 weeks shift slightly, like a weight redistributed. "This is more than I have for Bayard County," Tolliver said eventually, setting down his pen. "Significantly more." He looked at Elena. "How did you get 11 families to talk?" "I asked them," she said, "and I listened when they answered." He regarded her for a moment. "Most people in your position would have sold." "Most people in my position haven't had a chance to see the whole picture," she said. "Once you see it, selling feels different." Tolliver looked at Nathan. Some communication passed between them that Elena couldn't fully read. Professional and brief. Then Tolliver turned back to her. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Whitlock. Building a federal case takes time. Granger has lawyers, the kind that know how to stretch timelines. What you've gathered here is enough to open a formal investigation and issue protective orders on the disputed properties, but an indictment is—" He paused. "It doesn't happen in a week." "I know," she said. "Granger will know an investigation is opened. That will likely accelerate whatever he's planning locally. Before the law catches up with him, he may try to complete what he started." "I know that too." Tolliver looked at her steadily. "And you're staying?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Then we should talk about what that looks like for the next few weeks." She poured him coffee, the third cup since he'd arrived, and pulled her chair closer to the table, and they talked for another 2 hours, and when it was over and Tolliver had gone to his room at the hotel in town, Nathan stayed a little longer, as he usually did, sitting at the table with his finished coffee and his small notebook. "He'll do it," Nathan said. "He's thorough. Once he opens the file, it stays open." Elena was washing cups at the basin. "How long until Granger makes his move?" "Days, maybe less." A pause. "The three men on the road, 2 of them are still in the county. I've been keeping track of where they're staying." She looked over her shoulder at him. "And Dale Cutter?" "Arrived in Dry Creek yesterday." He said it with a flatness that conveyed everything he wasn't putting into his voice. "Staying at the Belmont, registered under his own name, which means he's not trying to hide that he's here. He wants us to know." "He wants you to know," Nathan said. "That's the message, that Granger is done being patient." She finished with the cups and dried her hands and turned around. Nathan was looking at her in that direct, measuring way he had. Not intimidating, just very present. She'd grown used to it. She'd grown used to him, which was a fact she was beginning to have feelings about that were probably not the most practical thing to be having feelings about right now, given everything. "Nathan," she said. He waited. "When this is over—" She stopped. She wasn't sure exactly what she'd been going to say. The sentence had gotten out ahead of her thinking. He didn't finish it for her. He just waited, the way he always waited, with that complete and unhurried patience that was one of the most unusual things about him. "Never mind," she said. "It can wait." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said, and didn't push it, which was exactly what she needed, and also somehow exactly what made it harder. They came on a Wednesday. Not the 3 men from the road. Granger had apparently decided that phase was finished. These were 2, Cutter and one other, a wide, quiet man who introduced himself as Mr. Brand and had the eyes of someone who had broken things before and expected to do so again. They came to the front door in the middle of the afternoon, when the sky was hard and white and the wind had died down to nothing, the kind of stillness that felt like held breath. Caleb was near the barn. Elena was in the house. She'd seen them coming from the window, had time to note that they rode slowly and stopped their horses well back from the porch, which meant they wanted to be seen approaching, wanted her to feel the waiting. She set down what she was doing, checked that Nathan's list of instructions was where she'd put it, and opened the door before they knocked. Dale Cutter was a long, lean man in his 50s with a face like sun-cured leather and a voice that had been trained to sound reasonable. He smiled at her. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. Miss Whitlock, he said, I hope we're not interrupting. You are, she said pleasantly. What can I do for you? He seemed mildly amused by that. He introduced himself, Dale Cutter, representing Western Continental land interests, without any apparent awareness of what those words meant to her, or possibly with complete awareness and simply not caring. We've made you a generous offer, Miss Whitlock. I was hoping we might discuss it in person. I've given you my answer. You've given our broker a non-response, which isn't quite the same thing. Still pleasant, still the practiced smile. Sometimes a conversation clarifies things that letters can't quite capture. The quiet man, Brand, hadn't said anything. He was standing slightly to Cutter's left, looking not at Elena, but at the property, the barn, the fence lines, the outbuildings, in the way a man looked at something he was calculating how to damage. Elena kept her eyes on Cutter. My answer is no. The property isn't for sale. That's been my answer since the first approach. It was my answer when Mr. Beckett asked, and it's my answer now. Something shifted in Cutter's face, not dramatically, just a small flattening of the pleasantness. Beckett was a misunderstanding, he said. We don't need to discuss him. What I'd like to discuss is the practical reality of your situation. A single woman running this place on 2 hired hands in a market that's getting harder every season. He paused, letting it sit. The offer on the table is more than fair. More than the land would bring in any conventional sale. It would allow you to establish yourself somewhere less. He seemed to select the word carefully. Demanding. I'm not looking for less demanding, Elena said. I like demanding. Brand made a small sound, not quite a laugh, something in the neighborhood. Cutter took a slow breath. The pleasantness was coming off in patches now, like paint in weather. Miss Whitlock, I think you may not fully appreciate the complexity of your current position. There are certain county records that suggest your father's survey from 1871 may have irregularities that could affect your title claim. Those records were created last month, said Nathan Cross. Both men turned. Nathan had come around the side of the house from the direction of the back fence line, moving at his regular unhurried pace, hat on, badge present. He stopped at the edge of the porch steps and looked at Cutter and Brand with the particular quality of attention he had. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just completely and entirely there. Cutter recovered quickly. Sheriff, didn't realize you were expected. I wasn't, Nathan said. I came to check on the fence line. He looked at Brand. I don't believe we've met. Brand said nothing. Mr. Brand, Cutter supplied. Mr. Brand, Nathan repeated. He looked at Brand with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who was memorizing something. You were in Tarrant County last spring, he said, during the dispute between the Okafor brothers and their upstream neighbor. Brand's eyes shifted. One small movement. Nathan saw it. Elena saw Nathan see it. I get around, Brand said. His voice matched his face, flat and careful. You do, Nathan agreed. I've been noticing. He looked back at Cutter. The survey irregularity claim you just mentioned. I'd encourage you to look at the date that document was filed before you use it again. It makes a poor impression when fabricated evidence has a timestamp that doesn't match the events it's meant to support. Cutter's pleasant voice had gone entirely now. What was underneath it was cooler and harder. That's a serious accusation, Sheriff. It's an accurate one. Nathan's voice was exactly the same as it always was. No performance to it. I've also filed this week a report with the Federal Land Office in San Antonio detailing Western Continental's acquisition activity in this county over the past 3 years. Inspector Tolliver is building on it. He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. I thought you should know, since you went to the trouble of coming out here in person. The silence that followed had a particular quality, not the silence of the standoff in a cheap story, not dramatic. Just 2 men recalculating, quickly, in the way men did when the ground turned out to be different from what they'd been told. Cutter looked at Elena. There was nothing pleasant left in his face. You're making a mistake. I've made them before, she said. This isn't one. Brand was still looking at the property. barn, fence, outbuildings. But something had changed in it. Less calculation, more the look of a man deciding whether a situation was worth what it was going to cost. It was Nathan who had told her 2 weeks ago. Hired men did the work they were paid for, and when the work started to look like it had legal consequences attached, they did arithmetic. That was not cowardice, Nathan had said. It was just math. Cutter gathered himself. The mask went back on, imperfectly. "We'll be in touch," he said. "You know where I am," Elena said. They walked back to their horses. Slowly, the way men walked when they needed to look like leaving was their choice. Elena watched them go. Beside her, Nathan watched them go. Neither of them moved until the horses were down the road and around the bend. Then Elena let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 5 minutes. It came out shakier than she would have liked. "The survey irregularity claim," she said. "Was that real?" "Filed 8 days ago, completely fabricated." Nathan's voice was still even, but there was something in it now that the last hour had stripped down to. "I found it when I was pulling county records for Tolliver. Whoever filed it was careless about the date because they didn't expect anyone to be looking that closely." "Will it hold up?" "For about 30 seconds in front of anyone with legal training." He paused. "They were testing how much you knew, whether you'd flinch." She thought about Cutter's face when he'd said it, the way he'd watched her for a reaction. "Did I give him what he was looking for?" "No," Nathan said. "You gave him the opposite." She crossed her arms and looked down the empty road. The hard white sky had gone slightly gold at the edges, late afternoon finding its angle. Her heart was still doing something irregular that she was actively ignoring. "Brand was looking at the barn," she said. "I know." "He was figuring out how hard it would be to burn." Nathan was quiet for a beat. "Yes," he said. "I know that too." She turned and looked at him. His face was doing the thing it did when he was angry, which was very nearly nothing, just a tightness around the jaw and a quality in the eyes like something compressed. It was, she'd come to understand, more frightening than most men's shouting. "Nathan," she said it quietly. He looked at her. She had not planned to say what she said next. She'd planned, actually, to say something practical about checking the barn locks and sending word to Tolliver. Instead, what came out was, "I'm glad it was you who knocked on my door." He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Something moved across his face, not performed, not held back, just real, the same way he was real about everything else. "So am I," he said, low and plain, no decoration on it. She held his gaze for one more second, then she looked back at the road. "We should check the barn locks," she said. "Yes," he agreed. They went to check the barn locks. They did not discuss what had just passed between them. But walking beside him across her father's yard in the last of the October light, Elena was aware that something had shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, not in the way of stories that tied things up neatly, just honestly, the way real things shifted, quietly, with weight. And in the barn, checking the latches with Caleb, watching from the corner and the gold light fading out through the gaps in the boards, Elena Whitlock understood something she hadn't let herself understand clearly before. She was not fighting only for the land anymore. She was fighting for this, for the life that was beginning to take shape in and around it, careful and hard-won and imperfect, and for the first time in a long time, entirely her own. The barn didn't burn that night, or the next night, or the one after that. What Granger did instead was quieter, and in some ways worse. Elena's regular feed supplier in Abilene sent word that he could no longer extend her credit account. A business decision, the letter said. No explanation beyond that. 3 days later, the man who shoed her horses told her apologetically that he'd taken on too many clients and couldn't fit her into his schedule anymore. On Friday, a county tax assessor she'd never seen before showed up unannounced and spent 2 hours measuring and photographing the property with the particular thoroughness of someone who'd been told to find something and was going to find it regardless. She wrote it all down, every incident, every date, every name. Nathan tracked the tax assessor back to a county office in a district where a commissioner named Elroy Hatch had taken a notable interest in Western Continental business over the past 2 years. He added Hatch's name to the file he was building for Tolliver, which was getting thick enough now that he'd moved it from his shirt pocket notebook to a locked box in his office. What Granger didn't understand, what Elena was counting on him not understanding, was that every move he made left a mark. He was used to working on people who didn't know they were being worked on. Isolation was his tool, and it only worked in the dark. In the light, it was just evidence. She told Tolliver about the feed supplier, about the farrier, about the tax assessor. Tolliver listened carefully and added it to his file and said, with the measured understatement of a federal inspector, "He's getting impatient." "Good," Elena said. "Impatient men make mistakes." Tolliver looked at her the way he'd started looking at her in their meetings, with a kind of professional respect that he tried to keep off his face and didn't quite manage. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "you have missed your calling." She didn't ask which calling he meant. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. The mistake came on a Monday. It came, as Granger's mistakes tended to, through a person, specifically through a man named Roy Alden, who had been Dale Cutter's bookkeeper for 4 years and who appeared at Nathan's office door at 7 in the morning looking like he hadn't slept in several days, which, it turned out, he hadn't. Nathan was alone in the office when Alden arrived. He looked at the man in the doorway, thin, somewhere in his late 30s, wearing the clothes of someone who'd dressed carefully and then spent the night in them, and said, "Sit down," before Alden had said a single word, because the look on the man's face made the invitation necessary. Alden sat. He put his hat on his knees and turned it in his hands, the same way Nathan had stood on Elena's porch weeks ago, and Nathan recognized the motion for what it was. A man working up to something he'd already decided but hadn't yet committed to out loud. "I kept records," Alden said, "of everything. Not because I planned to do this. I kept them because—" He stopped, started again. "Cutter isn't careful about who's in the room. I was always in the room. I wrote down what I heard and what I processed because I thought someday I might need it, and I didn't let myself think too hard about what that meant." Nathan waited. "He's going to do something to the Whitlock property," Alden said. "Not Cutter himself. He's contracted it out. There's a man coming from Fort Worth. Not Brand, someone else. Someone they use when they need something to look like an accident." He looked at Nathan with the hollow eyes of a man who had been carrying this for too long. "I heard the arrangement 2 days ago. I've been trying to decide what to do with it since." Nathan's expression didn't change. "What kind of accident?" Alden pressed his mouth together. "The barn was mentioned, also the water supply. And—" He stopped. "The woman. Not to hurt her. To frighten her badly enough that staying stops feeling possible." He turned his hat over again. "I don't know exactly what form that takes. I only heard the edge of it." The office was very quiet. Nathan sat with that information for precisely the amount of time it took him to assess it and decide what came next. "Do you have the records with you?" Alden reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheaf of papers, pages covered in small, precise figures and notes, dates and amounts and initials that Nathan would spend the next hour working through with growing recognition. Payment ledgers, transaction records, amounts dispersed to men whose names corresponded exactly to the names that kept appearing in the pattern Nathan had been tracing for weeks. And at the top of the chain of authorization, on 2 separate documents, a signature that was not Cutter's. Victor Granger had signed them himself. Nathan looked at those signatures for a long time. Then he looked at Alden. "Why are you here?" Alden looked down at his hat. "Because I've been telling myself for 4 years that I was just a bookkeeper, that keeping records wasn't the same as doing anything, that what Cutter did wasn't my business." He was quiet for a moment. "I was at the Mendoza place the day the debt papers were filed. I drove the wagon. I saw the family on the porch watching us go. The youngest girl was crying." He looked up. "I've been seeing that girl in my sleep for 2 years." Nathan folded the documents carefully and set them on the desk in front of him. "You understand what this means for you. I'm a material witness to fraud and coercion, probably accessory to some of it." Alden's voice was flat. Yes, I understand. And you're here anyway. I'm here anyway? He said it without heroics, just tiredness and decision. Nathan sent for Tolliver within the hour. He also sent his deputy Bill Crane to the Whitlock Ranch with a message that read, in its entirety, "Stay inside today. Keep Caleb close. I'll be there before dark." N. Elena read the note 3 times. She didn't like it. She followed it anyway, which cost her something, and she kept herself occupied by organizing the second notebook and writing a careful summary of every family account she'd collected, the kind of organized document that would hold up to scrutiny. She wrote it at her kitchen table and tried not to watch the window. By early afternoon, Nathan and Tolliver had been through Alden's records twice. What they had was better than Nathan had let himself expect. The ledger showed a direct line from Granger to the specific operations, payments to Cutter, payments to Brand, payments to the men who'd manufactured the Okafor water dispute, payments to the county commissioner, Elroy Hatch. Most critically, there were 2 entries showing funds dispersed for what was described only as Whitlock Resolution, final phase, dated 4 days ago, with an amount that was large enough to pay for something serious. "This is enough," Tolliver said. He'd gone very still in the focused way he had when he was certain of something. "Not for everything. We'll need the corroborating testimony from the families to close the full case. But for an arrest warrant and a protective injunction on the Whitlock property and all other properties in the corridor, this is enough." He looked at Nathan. "I can have federal authority behind this by morning if I send the wire now." "Send it now," Nathan said. "Granger will run if he hears the warrants coming." "Then we move before he hears." Nathan stood up. "What do you need from me?" "Keep Granger in the county tonight if you can. Legally." Tolliver was already folding documents, organizing with the rapid efficiency of a man shifting into a different gear. "And keep the Whitlock property secure." "I'm going there now," Nathan said. He was at her door before 5 o'clock. Elena opened it before he knocked, which meant she'd been watching the road, which meant she was more rattled than her composed expression was letting on. He noted that without commenting on it, because she had her dignity and he had no intention of making her defend it. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it. Alden, the ledgers, the Granger signatures, the final phase payment, Tolliver's wire. He told her straight and fast the way he'd learned she preferred, without softening the edges or managing her reaction. She listened standing at the kitchen counter with her arms crossed and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something difficult. Very still, eyes slightly unfocused, working through it privately before she responded. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Final phase," she repeated. "He sent someone." "Alden thinks so. We don't know when they arrive or exactly what they're planning, which means tonight we assume the worst and act accordingly." "Which means?" "Bill Crane is posted at the South Road. I'm staying here." He said it matter-of-factly because it was a matter of fact and not something that required negotiation. "Caleb in the barn. We keep lights on inside and makes the house look occupied and active." Elena looked at him. "You're staying the night?" "Yes." She held his gaze for a beat. "All right," she said. It wasn't entirely without self-consciousness, but she let that be visible, which was its own kind of honesty. "I'll make supper." He helped her. Not in a performative way. He'd noticed there were dishes to be washed from her afternoon, so he washed them while she cooked, moving around her kitchen with a practical ease that suggested he'd decided some time ago to stop being a guest in it. She noticed. She didn't remark on it. But something in her shoulders came down another fraction. They ate at the kitchen table and talked about the case, about Tolliver's wire and what federal authority would look like arriving in Dry Creek and what would happen to the families in the corridor once the protective injunction came through. They talked about Alden and what his testimony would cost him, and whether the law was likely to be as fair with him as it should be given that he'd come forward. Nathan thought it would probably land in a middle place that wasn't quite just, but was better than it could have been, which was the honest answer, and Elena accepted it as such. Around 9 o'clock, the conversation had quieted into something more comfortable than either of them remarked on, and Elena was sitting across the table with her coffee gone cold, and Nathan was doing the same, and he was looking at her in that way he had, direct, present, with nothing performed about it. And she looked back, and the kitchen was warm and the night outside was not. And she said, without entirely planning to, "I want to say something to you." He waited. The thing she'd said on the porch, "I'm glad it was you who knocked on my door," had been the beginning of something she'd been circling since. She'd been circling it with the particular caution of a woman who had learned to be careful about what she hoped for, and she was tired of circling it. "I don't know what this is," she said. Not an apology, just accuracy. "What's between us, I mean? I haven't let myself think about it too directly because there's been a great deal going on, and I wasn't sure if what I was feeling was—" She paused, searching for the honest word. "Real. Or just the situation." Nathan said nothing yet. He was listening in the way he listened, fully, without preparing his answer while she was still talking. "But I think it's real," she said. "I think you're one of the most genuinely decent people I've ever known, and I think you see me clearly, and that is not a small thing. To be seen clearly by someone and not found lacking." She looked at him. "I wanted you to know that, whatever else happens." He was quiet for a moment after she finished, long enough that she wondered, briefly, if she'd miscalculated badly. Then, "I told you I'd been meaning to ask you to something for 4 months," he said. "Yes. What I didn't say—" He stopped, restarted with the careful precision of a man who did not speak carelessly and knew it. "It wasn't the asking I was slow about. I knew what I wanted to ask. What I was slow about was believing I had any right to." He held her gaze. "I'm not an easy man to be near. I know that. I work too much and I don't talk enough, and I've been alone long enough that I've probably gotten worse at both." A beat. "You deserve someone who—" "Nathan." She said it quietly but firmly. "I'll decide what I deserve." He looked at her. Something in his face settled. The resistance coming off of it the way the pleasantness had come off Cutter's face, except this was the opposite thing. This was someone letting their actual face show. "Yes," he said, "you will. So stop managing what you think I should want," she said, "and just tell me what you want." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight of her father's kitchen and said, with the complete absence of decoration that was entirely, specifically, him, "I want this, you, whatever shape that takes from here." Elena sat with that for a moment. Then she nodded, once, slowly. "Good," she said. "That's what I wanted to know." They didn't kiss. Not then. The night was still uncertain outside, and there was too much left undone for anything to feel like an ending. But something had been said that couldn't be unsaid and didn't need to be. And when she got up to refresh the coffee, it felt different than it had an hour ago. The way a room felt different when you finally named what had been in it all along. The man from Fort Worth arrived around midnight. He came alone, which told Nathan something. This wasn't a group operation, which meant it was meant to be clean and quiet, which meant fire was the likely method. A single man with a can of kerosene and a match and a fast horse was harder to trace than a crew, and made better results look more accidental. He almost made it to the barn. Nathan was in the shadows near the fence when the figure crossed the yard. Not running, moving carefully the way experienced men moved when they thought they were unseen, close to the fence line, angling toward the barn's east wall. Caleb was inside with the horses. Nathan had made sure the horses were inside because you could rebuild a barn, but you couldn't bring back panicked animals, and he'd thought through the variables. He let the man get close enough to be committed to the act. Then, "Stop where you are." The man stopped. He stood very still for a moment, with the particular calculation of someone assessing his options. "Both hands where I can see them," Nathan said. He'd come around the fence post while he spoke, moving quietly in the way he moved when he was working, until he was close enough and at the right angle that the options were very limited. "I'd think carefully about what you do next. I know what you're here for, and I've been waiting for you for 6 hours, which means I'm not going to have much patience with anything athletic." The man's hands came up. He had kerosene, just as Nathan had expected, and a name, James Coward, which was too strange to be invented and turned out to be accurate, and a fee of $40, which was what Victor Granger's final phase budget had stretched to for one night's destruction. Nathan walked him to the porch and called inside. Elena opened the door and looked at the man, then at Nathan, then at the can of kerosene. Her face did several things in quick succession that she then composed into something neutral. Is he hurt? No. Are you? No. She looked at the kerosene can again. The barn, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then to Nathan. What do you need? Bill Crane is on the south road. I need you to light the signal lamp in the east window. We arranged it before I came. He looked at her steadily. Can you do that? Yes, she said, without a tremor. She went inside and lit the lamp. Nathan stood on the porch with James Coward and waited, and within 20 minutes Bill Crane arrived, and the man from Fort Worth was on his way to a cell in the Dry Creek Sheriff's Office, and it was 1:30 in the morning and the barn was still standing. Elena came back out to the porch after Crane left. She stood beside Nathan in the cold October night and looked at the barn, still there, same as it had always been, and breathed. He sent one man, she said. Budget and caution. A crew leaves witnesses. Will he talk? The man from Fort Worth? Coward? Nathan considered. He already started. He's not a loyal man. He's a contracted man. Those are different things. He paused. He confirmed Cutter's name inside of 10 minutes. By morning, he'll have given us everything he knows. Elena absorbed this. The pieces of it. Alden's records, Coward's arrest, Tolliver's wire, the ledgers with Granger's signature. They were stacking now, each one pressing against the next, and the structure that had seemed immovable 3 weeks ago was beginning to show its actual nature, which was that it was built on things that fell apart when light got into them. It's almost over, she said. Not triumphant, just recognizing it. The arrest part is almost over, Nathan said. The legal part takes longer. I know. She pulled her shawl tighter. Nathan, the families, the ones who sold, Marcos, the Mendozas, June Halbert. She looked at him. Tolliver said the protective injunction covers properties still held. What about the ones already lost? He was quiet for a beat. Fraud in property transfer can be challenged in federal court if the original transaction can be proven coerced. Tolliver knows. He's looking at it. A pause. I won't tell you it's certain. It's not. But it's possible. She nodded. She'd learned to take possible from Nathan and understand it as more than it sounded from most people, because he did not offer it unless he meant it. I want to tell them tomorrow, she said. The families. Whatever's happening, they should hear it from me, not through town gossip. I'll come with you. You don't have... I'll come with you, he said again, simply. She looked at him. He was looking at the barn too, at the dark yard, at the night that had turned out to contain what they'd prepared for, and nothing more and nothing worse. He looked tired. Not broken. Nathan Cross did not appear to be built toward broken, but honestly, humanly tired, with the particular quality of exhaustion that came not from the night's work, but from the weeks before it, from the careful, relentless accumulation of doing the right thing when it would have been much easier not to. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. He looked down at her hand, then he turned his over and held it. Not dramatically, just held it, the same way he did everything. Steadily, without flourish, like it was the most natural thing he'd ever done. They stood on the porch in the cold for a while after that, not talking much, looking out at the yard and the dark road and the barn that was still there. And the night settled around them the way nights did after things that had been building a long time finally broke and resolved into something you could breathe around. Victor Granger was arrested on a Thursday, not in Dry Creek. In San Antonio, where he'd apparently gone, Nathan suspected, because he'd heard something was wrong and was considering his options regarding the Mexican border. Federal deputies arrived at his hotel at 6 a.m. with the warrant Tolliver had secured, and Granger, who was, in person, apparently a compact, well-dressed man with silver hair and the careful courtesy of someone accustomed to being in control of rooms, asked to see the warrant before saying a single word, which suggested his lawyers had trained him well. For a moment they'd apparently always known might come, He said nothing else until those lawyers arrived. He didn't need to. Tolliver had more than enough without him. Cutter was arrested the same morning in Dry Creek, which was Nathan's operation and which went without incident, Cutter apparently having made a calculation similar to Brand's, that fighting a federal arrest was a cost he wasn't willing to pay. He was polite about it in a way that was worse than if he'd struggled, the politeness of a man who was already working out his next arrangement in his head. Brand was picked up in Fort Worth 2 days later. Elroy Hatch, the county commissioner, resigned his position on a Friday afternoon and was arrested getting on a train to Dallas on Saturday morning. Each piece fell in sequence, like a structure losing its supports one by one, and what had seemed solid and immovable for years turned out to be held up mainly by the assumption that no one was looking carefully enough. Once that assumption was gone, the rest came down fast. Elena heard about the arrests in pieces, the way news arrived in Dry Creek, imperfectly, out of order, colored by whoever was telling it. She heard about Granger from Tolliver directly, who came by that Thursday afternoon looking, for the first time since she'd met him, something close to satisfied. She heard about Cutter from Bill Crane, who mentioned it with the understated pride of a deputy who had done his part well. She heard about Hatch from Tom Pruitt, who told her at his counter with the barely contained delight of a man who had disliked the commissioner for years and felt fully vindicated. Each piece settled into her somewhere differently. Granger, she felt something she hadn't expected, which was not triumph but a kind of angry relief, the feeling of a thing you'd been braced against for weeks finally moving. Cutter. She felt colder because Cutter had stood on her porch and smiled at her and called her situation a practical reality, and that was something she would remember for a long time. Hatch. She mostly felt tired, because the corruption being that far into county offices meant the problem was larger than any one operation, and that was a truth she was still working out how to live with. She wrote all of it down. Not for Tolliver this time, just because writing was how she processed things, how she'd always processed them, even when she hadn't known that about herself. Nathan came that evening, and she made him sit down, and she told him what she was feeling, the pieces that weren't clean, the anger that didn't go away just because the immediate threat had. The worry about the families whose land was already gone and whose path back was uncertain. She told him because she'd learned that he could hold complicated things without needing them to be simpler, which was rarer than it sounded. He listened. He said, "The anger should stay. It's accurate." She looked at him. "That's not very comforting." "You didn't ask for comfort. You told me what you were feeling." He met her eyes. "The anger is correct. What happened to those families was wrong. Being glad Granger is arrested and also angry that it came this far. Those aren't contradictions." She sat with that. "The Mendoza girl," she said. "The youngest. She was 8 years old and she watched her family's south pasture get taken from them." She looked at her hands. "Being glad Cutter is in a cell doesn't fix that." "No," Nathan said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. "Does it bother you that the law is always—" She searched for the word. "Late." He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she knew he was answering honestly rather than reflexively. "Every day," he said. "That's why I do the job the way I do it. Because if I stop letting it bother me, I stop doing it well." He paused. "There's no version of this work that feels like enough. You just do the most you can and try to make the most of it count." She looked at this man across her kitchen table, this quiet, careful, tired, honest man, and thought about the harvest dance and the cold note and the specific series of accidents and choices that had brought him to her door and her to this moment, and she thought that life was the strangest possible thing in the way it sometimes built itself, without your input or planning, toward something you wouldn't have thought to want. "Nathan," she said, When the case is settled and Tolliver is done and the court dates are set," she stopped. "I want to keep having supper with you." He looked at her. Something in his face went very quiet and very warm at once, which was its own kind of thing to see. "I was going to ask you the same thing," he said. "I was going to ask you properly." "You can still ask me properly." "I will." A beat. "Give me a week." She almost smiled. "You still talk slower than other men." "I know," he said. "You've managed so far. She did smile then, actually, fully, without catching it. It changed her face entirely, and he watched it happen with the focused, unguarded attention of a man seeing something he intended to keep seeing. "A week," she said. "A week," he confirmed. And outside the Whitlock kitchen, in the dark of a Texas October, the road was empty and the barn was standing, and the case that had begun with a cold note under a door was making its way towards something that looked, if not exactly like justice, because justice was always late and incomplete and never quite enough, then at least like the beginning of it, which was, Elena was learning, sometimes what you got, and sometimes, if the rest of it was good enough, it was enough. Nathan kept his word. He waited exactly 1 week. On a Saturday afternoon, 7 days after he'd said, "Give me a week," across her kitchen table, he arrived at the Whitlock Ranch not at his usual working hour, but later, past 4 o'clock, when the light was going amber and the air had the particular cold sweetness of November coming in behind October's last warmth. He was not in his work clothes. He was wearing a clean shirt that she'd never seen before, and his good coat, and his hat was in his hands. Elena saw him coming from the window. She stayed at the window a moment longer than she needed to, watching him cross the yard with that steady, unhurried walk, and felt something in her chest that she'd stopped trying to talk herself out of. She met him at the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. He turned the hat in his hands once, that same gesture she'd cataloged the very first night without knowing why she was cataloging it, and said, "I'd like to ask you something." "All right," she said. "I'd like to court you," he said, "properly. With your knowledge and consent, and without any other motive than the fact that I think you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I'd like the chance to demonstrate that over time, if you'll allow it." It was, she thought, the most words she'd ever heard him say in a row. She looked at him standing in her doorway in his good coat with his hat in his hands, this quiet, honest, difficult, decent man, and she thought about the cold note, and the dance, and the months between then and now, all the ways that life had bent and surprised her, all the ways she'd had to be harder than she'd planned on being. And she thought that sometimes the world arranged things in a way that made no sense until suddenly, from a certain angle, it made all the sense there was. "Yes," she said, "I'll allow it." He almost smiled. She knew it by now for what it was. "Good," he said. "Come in," she said. "I made supper." He came in. The trial of Victor Granger began in a federal court in San Antonio in February of 1885, 4 months after his arrest. It lasted 3 weeks. Elena was there for the first week and the last. The middle week she couldn't attend because the mercantile business she'd been quietly building since fall had a delivery complication that required her personal presence, which was the kind of problem she would once have seen as an intrusion and now recognized as evidence that her life was actually moving forward, which she chose to take as a good sign. Nathan testified on the second day. She wasn't there for it, but he described it to her that evening in the hotel dining room where they'd taken to eating supper during the trial weeks. Methodically, precisely, walking through the evidence the way he'd assembled it, answering every question the defense put to him with the same unrattled accuracy that had characterized every step of the investigation. The defense tried twice to suggest he had a personal interest in the case. Nathan agreed that he did. The protection of his county's residents was a personal interest he held deeply, and offered nothing further, which the defense apparently found unsatisfying, and the jury apparently found credible. Marcos Reyes testified on the 4th day. Elena had been there for that one. She'd sat in the 3rd row and watched Marcos walk to the stand with the careful posture of a man who had decided something about himself, and she'd listened to him tell his story. The debt claim, the pressure, the sale he'd made with his family's safety weighing on every word of it, in a voice that started quiet and got steadier as it went. Rosa Reyes was in the gallery. At one point during cross-examination, when the defense attorney suggested that Marcos had sold willingly and was now revising his memory for legal convenience, Marcos had looked at the attorney with a patience that was almost frightening and said, "I know what I signed and why I signed it, and I know what I lost, and there is no version of my memory that needs revising." The gallery had gone very still. Elena had written it down. She still wrote things down. It was a habit she suspected she'd have for the rest of her life. June Halbert testified on the 6th day. She wore her best dress and sat in the witness chair with the posture of someone who had been hit and decided not to fall down, which was how she'd sat in her house the first day Elena came to visit. And she told the court exactly what had been done to her, and she did not minimize it, and she did not apologize for her emotions when they showed briefly during the account of the third visit from Granger's man. And the jury watched her the way people watched something true. Francisco Mendoza testified on the seventh day. The youngest Mendoza girl was in the gallery. She was 8 years old and sat completely still for 2 hours and watched her father speak. And Elena, watching her, thought about what it meant for a child to see their parent stand up in public and say this was wrong, and I am saying so out loud. What that planted in a person, what it grew into. The defense made its closing argument on the 17th day. It was technically accomplished, and it acknowledged certain irregularities while attributing them to overzealous subordinates and incomplete communication chains and the general complexity of large land acquisition operations. It did not mention Victor Granger's signature on Roy Alden's ledger pages because there was nothing useful to say about that. The prosecution's closing argument took 40 minutes. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on 11 counts. Fraud, coercion, conspiracy to commit property crimes, bribery of a public official, and several subsections of federal land acquisition law that Tolliver had spent considerable time identifying and documenting. Cutter was convicted separately on 8 counts, Brand on 3, Hatch on 5, including the bribery charge that Nathan had built from the commissioner's name in Alden's ledger. Roy Alden received a reduced sentence and a public acknowledgement in Tolliver's final report of his cooperation, which was not the same as forgiveness and not the same as absolution, but was something. He'd told Nathan, the last time they'd spoken, that he was going back to Missouri when it was done, to a sister he hadn't seen in 6 years. Nathan had told him that seemed like a reasonable plan. Elena was in the courtroom for the verdict. She sat in the third row and listened to the judge read the counts and heard the word guilty 11 times, and felt something move through her that was not triumph and not relief and not joy, or not only those things. It was more complicated. It was the feeling of a long weight setting down, of something that had required her total sustained effort for months, finally releasing her back to herself. She thought about her father, about the boards of this house he'd nailed himself, about the survey he'd paid for properly in 1871, about the land that had been meant to be something that lasted. She thought about how none of what had happened to her, the note, the dance, Nathan's knock on her door, the notebook, the families, the months of careful accumulation, none of it would have been necessary in a more honest world. She felt the anger of that, accurately, as Nathan had said, without apology. And underneath the anger, something quieter, something that had taken root in the worst of it and grown in spite of it, the way things sometimes did. She thought, I am still here. The land is still mine. And the people who tried to take it are facing what they did. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough, exactly. But it was real and it was true, and she had fought for it with her whole self, and that counted for something that no verdict could give or take away. Nathan was beside her when the verdict was read. He did not reach for her hand in the courtroom. Too public, too performative, not his way. But when they came out onto the courthouse steps into the thin February sunlight, he stood close enough that their shoulders touched, and he said quietly, "You did this." "We did this," she said. "The families did it," he said. "You made them believe it was possible." He paused. "That's different from what I did. I collected evidence. You collected people." She looked at him. The February light was honest and cold on his face, the scar along his jaw, the gray eyes that she'd been looking at for 4 months now and still found she hadn't exhausted. "I learned from you," she said, "about patience, about building something carefully." "You had that already," he said. She thought about that. Maybe she had. Maybe it had just needed the right set of circumstances to show itself. The worst possible circumstances, as it turned out, which was perhaps the only kind that ever showed you what you were actually made of. "Nathan," she said. That thing you were going to ask me." She looked at him sideways. "Properly." He looked at her. "I said I'd ask you properly. It's been 4 months. I've been building a case." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her, and she turned to face him on the courthouse steps in San Antonio in February, with the cold light on both of them, and the sound of the street below, and the sound of her own heart doing something she'd given up trying to manage sensibly. "Then ask me," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who rushed things, and he was not a man who performed them, and what he did was look at her with the complete and serious attention he gave to things that mattered to him, which was, she'd learned, the highest form of regard he had. And he said, "Elena Whitlock, will you marry me?" Not a question, quite, the way he said it. Like a statement of intention that was also an asking, like a man who had decided and was now including her in the decision rather than proposing the decision hadn't already been made. She thought about saying you could have inflected that as a question. She thought about making him work a little harder. She thought about all the ways she might be clever about this. Instead, she said yes, because it was the true answer, and she was tired of circling truth. He did something then that she hadn't quite seen from him before. He let out a breath, a real one, the kind that held relief in it, the kind that said he had not been entirely certain, which surprised her, which she realized she should probably tell him was endearing, except that she didn't have the chance, because he'd taken her face in both hands and kissed her right there on the courthouse steps in the thin February sunlight, which was the most public thing she'd ever seen Nathan Cross do, and which she decided she would remember for the rest of her life. They were married in April. The wedding was in Dry Creek, at the town hall where 7 months earlier Elena had walked through the door on Nathan's arm after Harrison Beckett's cold note, with the whole town watching and the fiddle playing and everything uncertain. The town hall looked different dressed for a wedding. Or maybe it was that Elena looked at it differently now, from inside something rather than outside it, from the solid ground of a life that had been tested and hadn't broken. Marcos and Rosa Reyes came. June Halbert came, in her best dress again, and this time she smiled at the fiddle player instead of watching him with the careful composure of someone managing their own feelings. The Mendoza family came, and the youngest daughter wore a yellow ribbon in her hair and ran in the yard with the other children and laughed in the uncomplicated way of a child who had not yet been required to carry the full weight of what had happened to her family, and Elena hoped would have a few more years before she did. Francisco Mendoza found Elena before the ceremony and shook her hand, not the gesture of the uncertain man who'd said it doesn't give us back the south pasture in the Whitlock barn, but something different, the handshake of a man who had stood in a federal courtroom and been believed. "Thank you," he said. That was all. Elena thought it was enough. Tolliver was there, which surprised her. He appeared at the edge of the gathering with the slightly uncertain air of a federal inspector attending a frontier wedding, which was perhaps not his natural environment. She went to him and he congratulated her with his precise, careful warmth and said that the Reyes and Mendoza land claims were in federal review and that he expected a ruling within the year. "I won't promise," he said, "but the record is clear." "That's what I asked for," Elena said. "That's all I asked for." He nodded. Then, with a sincerity that sat differently on him than official communication, he said, "What you did, organizing those families, keeping those records. I've been in this work for 15 years, and I've seen maybe 2 other civilians do what you did. I wanted to say that before today passed." She thanked him. She meant it. Bill Crane gave a toast that was well-intentioned and slightly too long, and made Nathan look at the ceiling in the patient way he looked at things that were harmless and unavoidable. Elena laughed at that, at Nathan's ceiling look, and he caught her laughing at him, and the almost smile appeared, and she thought, "This is what I'm marrying, this exact thing, all of it." The fiddle player struck up a reel. Nathan held out his hand. She took it. They danced, and the room danced around them, and Dry Creek celebrated in the way of a town that had reason to. Not because everything was perfect, not because the world had been made fair, but because something real had been done by real people who hadn't had any particular guarantee of success and had done it anyway. The years that followed were not easy, and Elena would have been suspicious of them if they were. The mercantile business she'd been building since the previous fall became, by the following spring, a genuine enterprise, a proper store on Main Street in Dry Creek that she ran with the same organized stubbornness she'd applied to everything else, knowing her suppliers and her accounts and the particular needs of ranch families because she was one. She extended credit carefully to people she believed in, and she was wrong sometimes and right more often, and the business grew. She kept part of the Whitlock land always, not as a working ranch anymore. She let that go when it became clear she couldn't run both, which cost her something she didn't pretend it didn't, but as land. Her father's land, with its properly surveyed western boundary and its creek access and its old boards that he'd nailed himself. She leased the grazing rights to the Mendoza brothers at a fair price, which was a solution that had presented itself one afternoon and felt, when it came, exactly right. Nathan rose steadily in the law, not because he sought it, but because people who encountered his work tended to recommend him to people in positions to offer him more of it. He became a regional officer covering 4 counties, which meant he was away more than either of them liked, and home with an intensity of appreciation for being home that she found she also liked, very much. They argued sometimes, about his hours, about her tendency to take on more than she'd acknowledged taking on, about the particular stubbornness they both had that occasionally ran directly into itself. Those arguments were real and sometimes ugly and always resolved, not because either of them was especially good at apologizing, but because they were both constitutionally incapable of leaving things unfinished. They had 3 children. The first, a girl, came in the winter of 1886 and had Nathan's gray eyes and Elena's iron spine, which combination was going to make her a problem for the world in the best possible way. The second, a boy, came 2 years later, quiet and watchful, who would sit at the kitchen table when Nathan did his paperwork and watch his father work with an attention that was so recognizable it made Elena's chest ache. The third, another girl, came in 1890 and was the loudest of them and the funniest and demanded explanation for everything, which Elena encouraged and Nathan occasionally found exhausting and loved completely. The Mendoza land claim was resolved in 1886, 14 months after the trial. The ruling found the original debt filing fraudulent and the subsequent sale coerced, and ordered the south pasture returned to Francisco and Maria Mendoza, minus a small parcel that had already been built upon and was settled separately with compensation. It was not everything. It was the most the law could do, and Francisco and Maria stood in their recovered pasture, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and that silence was its own kind of complete. The Reyes property came back in 1887. Marcos and Rosa moved back to the county, back to a piece of what had been theirs. Rosa planted a kitchen garden the first week. Marcos rebuilt the fence that had come down before they left, slowly, post by post, as though he was making a point to something. June Halbert's situation was more complicated. Her property had been subdivided and partially sold again, and the legal untangling took 3 more years and didn't end in full recovery. She got back a portion. She accepted it with the posture of a woman who had decided that partial was better than none, which was true, and that she'd been standing before and could keep standing, which was also true, and Elena visited her when she could and sat with her in the way of women who had been through something together that didn't require constant discussion to be understood. Not everyone got their land back. That was the truth that Elena carried forward and did not round off into something comfortable. The law was what it was, powerful within its limits and limited beyond them. Some losses were too old, or too legally complex, or too entangled to recover, and those families had to find their way through a world that had taken something from them and wasn't going to give it back. She thought about that. She kept thinking about it, in the years that followed, in the way you kept thinking about things that were true and painful and didn't resolve cleanly. She didn't know what to do with it except to do the things that were actually possible. Keep the store fair, know her neighbors, extend credit when she believed in someone, speak up in county meetings when things felt wrong, teach her children that the world owed them nothing except the same chance as anyone else, and that even that had to be watched carefully. Nathan told her once, in the winter of 1888, that she was harder than she'd been when he'd first known her. She'd looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It's not." He'd been quiet a moment. "You used to try to be fair about people before you trusted them. Now you trust carefully, but you don't try to be fair about it." She thought about that. "I don't have time to be wrong the same way twice," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "I just want to make sure you still believe people are mostly worth it." She looked back at him. At this man she knew by now the way you knew a house you'd lived in long enough to understand where every board creaked, and where the light was good, and where the wind came in, and how to live around all of it. Most of them, she said. Yes, I still think most of them are. He nodded. Good, he said. So do I. They sat together in the kitchen that night, the children in bed, the lamplight warm, and the October wind outside. There was always October wind in her memory of the best parts of her life, which made sense if you thought about where it all started. And she looked at the kitchen table where she'd first opened a blank notebook, where she'd laid out Marcos Reyes's tin box documents, where a federal inspector had drunk 3 cups of coffee and built a case out of what she'd gathered, and she thought about all the things that table had held. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that the cold note Harrison Beckett had slipped under her door had been the worst thing that happened to her, and also, in the sideways way that life sometimes worked, the first step toward the best of it. Not because suffering made things better, she didn't believe that, had never believed it, but because who you were in the face of suffering sometimes showed you things about yourself you wouldn't otherwise have known, and sometimes showed you people you wouldn't otherwise have found. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her what she'd learned from all of it. She thought she'd say, "Be careful who you trust, and trust anyway, because the alternative is a smaller life than you deserve. Fight for what's yours, but know what's actually yours. The land matters, and it matters less than the people on it. Speak up even when you're not sure anyone will listen, because sometimes the people who most need to hear you are the ones you don't expect. And when a man with honest eyes and his hat in his hands asks you a question you've been afraid to want the answer to, say yes. Say yes and find out what comes next." People in Dry Creek talked about Elena and Nathan Cross for years. They talked about the harvest dance, and the cold note, and the sheriff who'd shown up at the right moment, and the longer story got in the telling, the more it acquired the shape of a romance, which it was. But it was also something harder and more specific than that, something that didn't fit as neatly into the version people preferred. What it actually was, what Elena understood it to be in her own accounting, was 2 people who had each spent a long time being careful and alone, and who had found, in the middle of someone else's scheme to destroy what she'd built, that careful and alone wasn't the whole story, that there was a version of life on the other side of that, if you were willing to be seen clearly and see clearly in return, and if you were willing to fight for what mattered and know what was worth fighting for. The town remembered them not as a love story exactly, though it was that. Not as a victory over corruption, though it was that too. They remembered them as the couple who had changed things, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the patient, accumulating way that real change happened, if it happened at all. Elena remembered it differently, as the people in the stories always do. She remembered the note in the stove. She remembered the first time she looked at the county map and understood the shape of what was being done to her neighbors. She remembered Marcos Reyes's face when he decided. She remembered standing in her father's barn with 11 scared families and a lantern overhead and feeling, for the first time in a long time, something that she would call purpose, because hope felt too fragile and purpose did not. She remembered her kitchen table and the notebooks and the coffee she poured without asking, and the way Nathan took it without looking up. She remembered the courthouse steps and the February light and the feeling of a weight setting down after a very long time of carrying it. And she remembered, most particularly, most enduringly, the knock on the door. 3 knocks. Even, unhurried. Not demanding, not hesitant, just present. The knock of a man who had something honest to offer and was offering it and was willing to wait. She thought sometimes about what would have happened if she hadn't answered. If she'd stayed on the other side of the door and let the evening pass and spent the harvest dance alone with the note's ash in the stove. She thought about it and then she let it go, because it hadn't happened that way, and imagining otherwise was a waste of time she didn't have. She'd opened the door. That was what she'd done. That was the whole beginning of it. Not the note, not the dance, not even Nathan's knock. Her opening the door. Her choosing to. She thought that was the part worth remembering. Not what had been done to her, not even how she'd survived it, but the moment she'd chosen to reach towards something rather than away from it, when everything in her history said caution and a voice somewhere deeper said open the door. She had. And everything that followed, the good and the hard and the costly and the irreplaceable, had come through that opening. That was, Elena Cross decided, in the particular accounting she kept for herself in the quiet hours of a life she had built and defended and shared and would continue building as long as she had the strength for it. That was enough. More than enough. The only kind of enough that ever actually was.